Think for a moment. How much of the story of Jesus that you know comes directly from ancient history, and how much of it has been carefully chosen and filtered through the hands of powerful institutions? Imagine if there were hidden years of his life that the church itself tried to erase, because the truth of those years might change everything you thought you knew about him, about faith, and about the very foundation of spirituality. What if those missing years held not just details about where he traveled, but the profound teachings he gathered, teachings so radical and transformative that authorities feared they would shatter their control? Today, you are about to walk with me through one of the greatest mysteries of all time. And stay until the end, because the final revelation is the most important of all. It will not only challenge history, but may transform your understanding of Jesus and his true mission. Before we go deeper, I invite you to subscribe to this channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your participation fuels this search for truth, and I promise what you will discover in this journey might forever change the way you see the life of Christ, the church, and the very universe itself. Now let us begin. The Bible, as we know it today, gives us a fragmented image of Jesus. We are told of his miraculous birth, a single episode from his childhood at the age of 12, when he amazed the teachers in the temple with his wisdom, and then silence, an unsettling silence. 18 years of his life, completely absent from the Gospels, until suddenly he reappears at the age of 30, preaching, gathering disciples, and performing miracles. What happened in those years? Where was he? And why has this period been buried under centuries of silence? Many historians and spiritual seekers believe that the so-called missing years of Jesus are among the most censored mysteries in history. Ancient texts, banned gospels, and forgotten traditions point to journeys far beyond the small towns of Galilee. Some suggest he traveled to Egypt, others to India, Tibet, or even as far as lands unknown to the Roman world. There are whispers of him studying with mystics, priests, and sages, absorbing the deepest esoteric wisdom of the ancient world. Imagine Jesus sitting with Hindu masters, learning the philosophy of reincarnation, or walking through the temples of Egypt, encountering the echoes of Hermetic teachings. What if he brought all of this back to the Holy Land, fusing it into a message of love and liberation, so powerful that religious authorities could not contain it? The silence of the Gospels is not an accident. The early church, eager to establish a narrative of control, chose what to include and what to omit. The Council of Nicaea in the 4th century, guided by political ambitions as much as by faith, rejected many Gospels and writings that painted a more complex, mystical, and universal image of Christ. Could it be that the missing years were deliberately erased to preserve a more convenient story, one that focused less on universal wisdom and more on obedience to authority? The Indian philosopher Swami Abhedananda, during his travels in Tibet in the early 20th century, reported discovering ancient manuscripts that spoke of a young prophet named Isa, who came from the West and studied the laws of compassion and the Vedas with Hindu and Buddhist teachers. Similarly, the Russian traveler Nicholas Notovich in the 19th century claimed to have found records in the Hemis monastery in Ladakh describing the life of Isa, believed to be Jesus, during the very years missing from the Bible. Though both claims have been contested, they ignite the imagination. Why would stories of Jesus appear in traditions so distant from Judea if there were no connection at all? Think about this. If Jesus truly traveled eastward, absorbing teachings of reincarnation, meditation, and non-violence, how would that change your understanding of his later message? Could his famous Sermon on the Mount bear echoes of Eastern philosophy? Could his insistence on compassion, humility, and inner transformation reflect not only the heritage of Judaism, but also the universal wisdom of humanity? And here lies the discomfort. If the Church acknowledged these connections, its monopoly on truth would crumble. For centuries, it has presented Christianity as the sole and exclusive path. But the missing years of Jesus hinted a reality far greater, that he sought wisdom wherever it was found, that his mission was not to build walls between religions, but to reveal the unity of all paths that lead to God. This truth, if embraced, would dissolve centuries of dogma. Imagine believers realizing that Jesus might have been not only the Son of God in Christian tradition, but also a universal seeker of truth, bridging East and West. It would mean that spiritual authority does not belong to one institution, but to humanity itself. No wonder these years were erased, banned, and condemned to silence. Now let me ask you, what do you think happened in those hidden years? Could the Jesus you know have been shaped by secret journeys across the world, gathering wisdom from sages and mystics? Share your thoughts in the comments, because in this dialogue lies the true spirit of discovery. And stay with me, because we are only beginning. Ahead we will uncover manuscripts, forbidden gospels, and the shocking reasons why the church feared the truth of Jesus' missing years. And remember, the final revelation will be the most powerful of all. When we look deeper into the historical record, or rather into the lack of it, the silence of the Bible becomes even more suspicious. Why would a story as important as the life of Jesus deliberately omit nearly 2 decades of his existence? The argument often given by traditional theologians is that these years were unimportant, that the only thing worth knowing is his divine mission, which began at 30. But think carefully. Could 18 years of anyone's life, especially of a figure like Jesus, truly be irrelevant? Or is it more likely that what happened during that time was considered too dangerous, too disruptive, to be allowed into the official narrative? Imagine a young man in Galilee, gifted with extraordinary wisdom even at the age of 12, disappearing from the written record. By the time he reappears, he speaks with an authority that astonishes crowds. He preaches love and forgiveness, but also challenges rigid dogmas. His parables carry echoes of ideas far older than his immediate culture. How did he gain this knowledge? Where did he cultivate the spiritual depth that would shake the world? Some scholars point to Egypt as the first destination in his hidden years. Egypt, after all, was a place where Jewish families often sought refuge, as his own family did shortly after his birth. But Egypt was also a land rich with ancient spiritual traditions, Hermeticism, mystery schools, and initiations that delved into the secrets of the soul. Could it be that Jesus studied in temples that still carried the wisdom of Thoth and the legacy of Atlantis, knowledge preserved by the priests for thousands of years? Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher who lived during the time of Jesus, described the Therapeuti, a community of mystics in Egypt dedicated to meditation, healing, and contemplation. Their practices sound strikingly similar to the teachings Jesus would later share. From Egypt, traditions suggest he may have journeyed further east. The Gospels are silent, but ancient apocryphal texts and local legends from India to Tibet whisper another story. Nicholas Notovich's controversial discovery in Ladakh spoke of Isa learning the Vedas, mastering the sutras, and preaching compassion to all living beings. Even if historians debate the authenticity of these manuscripts, the resonance between Jesus's later words and Eastern philosophy is undeniable. The idea that the kingdom of God is within you mirrors the Upanishads' teaching that the divine dwells within the soul. The call to love one's enemies resonates with Buddhist teachings on compassion and detachment from hatred. These parallels are too profound to be dismissed as mere coincidence, but here is where it becomes even more intriguing. Some of the earliest Christian sects, the Gnostics, preserved teachings that hinted at a more mystical Jesus, one who spoke of inner enlightenment, of the divine spark within each person, and of liberation from material illusions. These were not teachings of blind obedience, but of personal awakening, ideas that echoed the very philosophies found in Eastern traditions. The Gnostic texts, like the Gospel of Thomas discovered at Nag Hammadi, show us a Jesus who said, "The kingdom is inside you and it is outside you." Such ideas were considered heretical by the early church because they placed divine authority not in priests or bishops, but in the individual's direct experience of God. Now ask yourself, why would such teachings be declared dangerous? The answer is simple: power. If Jesus had spent his missing years learning universal truths that empowered every soul to seek God directly, the Church's claim to be the sole mediator between humanity and the divine would collapse. And so, the narrative was shaped to exclude these years, to erase these influences, to ensure that Christianity could become an institution of authority rather than a path of liberation. This leads us to one of the most critical questions. Is it possible that the Church's greatest fear was not that people would doubt Jesus, but that they would truly understand him? Because if humanity embraced the idea that Jesus was not only the Christ of one faith, but also a universal teacher who bridged the wisdom of East and West, no hierarchy could hold the keys to salvation. The truth would be within everyone's reach, Consider also the radical nature of his message when he finally appeared at 30. He openly defied the Pharisees and Sadducees, dismantling rigid interpretations of the law. He healed on the Sabbath, forgave sinners, and embraced those society rejected. This was not the teaching of someone confined by the narrow traditions of his time. It was the teaching of someone who had seen the broader tapestry of human spirituality. Someone who had walked among sages, who had tasted the wisdom of many lands, and who returned to his people with a message that could ignite freedom in the soul. But if this is true, then the missing years hold a secret more powerful than any miracle. They reveal the process by which Jesus became the teacher we know, the process that institutions tried to hide. And this is where you must reflect. If his journey was erased, what else might have been hidden from you? What other truths lie beneath centuries of dogma and censorship? Pause for a moment and imagine. If tomorrow the Vatican admitted that documents existed, proving Jesus had studied in India or Tibet, how would that reshape the Christian faith? Would it weaken it, or would it reveal its universal foundation, connecting it to the wisdom of all humanity? Would it break your faith, or make it infinitely stronger, knowing that the Son of God embraced every path that led to the divine? We are only scratching the surface. In what follows, we will uncover the forbidden Gospels, the censored writings, and the chilling historical decisions that silenced this story. And remember, the greatest revelation still awaits at the end, one that ties together the missing years with a truth so profound that the Church feared it above all else. To truly grasp why the missing years of Jesus are so heavily guarded by silence, we must turn our attention to the forbidden Gospels, the writings that were excluded from the official canon by the early Church. These texts, suppressed for centuries, often portray a Jesus who is far more mystical, esoteric, and revolutionary than the image sanctioned by religious authorities. They reveal teachings that speak not of blind obedience, but of inner transformation and divine self-realization, ideas that would have threatened the very foundations of ecclesiastical power. Take, for example, the Gospel of Thomas, discovered in Nag Hammadi in 1945. Unlike the canonical Gospels, it contains no narrative of miracles or crucifixion. Instead, it presents 114 sayings of Jesus, many of them secret teachings shared only with his closest disciples. In one striking passage, he declares, "The kingdom is inside you and it is outside you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will realize that you are the children of the living Father." These words are radical. They strip away the need for external mediators and place the responsibility for salvation directly in the hands of each individual. Could this reflect the wisdom Jesus gathered in his hidden years, blending the essence of Gnostic thought with echoes of Eastern philosophy? The Gospel of Mary, another banned text, portrays Mary Magdalene not as a marginal figure, but as a central disciple who received profound spiritual revelations. In this Gospel, she recounts visions of the soul's journey beyond death, insights that resonate with both Platonic philosophy and Buddhist teachings on liberation from the cycle of rebirth. Why would the Church reject this Gospel? Perhaps because it not only elevated a woman to the highest level of spiritual authority, but also revealed a dimension of Jesus' teachings too mystical, too universal to be controlled. These suppressed writings remind us of something crucial. The early Christian world was not monolithic. There were countless interpretations of who Jesus was and what he taught. Some emphasized ritual, others focused on mystical union with the divine. The version that triumphed was not necessarily the truest one, but the one most useful to political and religious institutions. Emperor Constantine, through the Council of Nicaea in 325, sought unity not in spiritual truth, but in political power. By deciding which Gospels were acceptable and which were heretical, the Church crystallized a single narrative, one that ignored the missing years, silenced alternative voices, and established itself as the sole guardian of divine knowledge. But here lies a paradox. Even within the canonical Gospels, glimpses of something deeper remain. Jesus repeatedly hints at mysteries he shares only with those ready to hear. He speaks of secrets hidden since the foundation of the world, of parables that reveal truths only to those with eyes to see and ears to hear. Could it be that his public teachings were only the surface, while the real essence of his wisdom, perhaps drawn from his hidden years, was passed down in secret to those who were prepared to understand? Modern scholars such as Elaine Pagels a renowned expert on Gnosticism, have argued that the diversity of early Christianity was deliberately erased. She notes that the Gnostic vision presented a Jesus who did not demand conformity, but encouraged direct spiritual experience. Similarly, the theologian Rudolf Bultmann suggested that the Church overlaid the original message of Jesus with layers of myth and dogma, obscuring his true intent. These perspectives remind us that what we know today as Christianity may be only a shadow of a much greater and more universal truth. Let us pause here and reflect. If the forbidden Gospels and hidden years point to a Jesus who embraced wisdom beyond Judea, what does that say about the faith that bears his name? Could Christianity at its core be far more universal, inclusive, and transformative than the narrow version often preached? And if so, what does it mean for us today? Are we being invited, even now, to rediscover the fullness of his message? A message that transcends the walls of any one institution. Consider also the deliberate nature of suppression. The Church did not merely ignore these texts, it actively sought to destroy them. Entire communities were branded heretical, hunted, and silenced. The Cathars of medieval France, for example, were massacred for preserving mystical teachings that echoed the Gnostic vision of Christianity. What did they know that was so dangerous? Could it be that they held remnants of the lost wisdom of the missing years? And yet, despite centuries of suppression, fragments of this truth continue to resurface. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Nag Hammadi Library, and countless apocryphal writings remind us that history is never fully buried. Truth has a way of returning, no matter how fiercely it is opposed. These discoveries are not mere coincidences. They are invitations, perhaps even divine ones, to look deeper, to question what we have been told, and to seek the truth beyond dogma. Now, I ask you, do you believe that Jesus intended his message to be limited to a single church, a single dogma, a single narrative? Or do you feel deep within that his life and teachings were meant to reveal a universal path of awakening, one that belongs to all humanity? Share your thoughts, because your voice is part of this search for truth. And prepare yourself, because in the next part, we will unveil the final and most profound revelation, a truth hidden not only in manuscripts and legends, but in the very essence of Jesus' message, a truth so powerful that if embraced, it could dissolve centuries of illusion and awaken the world to a new vision of the Christ who walked among us. The greatest secret about the missing years of Jesus is not merely where he traveled or which masters he studied with. The real secret lies in what he brought back, the synthesis of wisdom so profound that it could have united humanity, dissolved boundaries, and elevated consciousness beyond anything the world had seen before. And this is precisely why the Church feared it above all else. Imagine Jesus returning at the age of 30. He has walked in Egypt, absorbing the remnants of Hermetic mysteries. He has traveled eastward, learning from Hindu and Buddhist sages about meditation, reincarnation, and compassion. He has studied the law of Moses, the Psalms of David, and the fiery words of the prophets. And now, he weaves them all together into a single truth, that every soul carries the spark of God within, that every human being can awaken to divine union, and that love is the force that binds the universe. This truth was unstoppable. It spoke to the poor and the broken, offering liberation not from Rome but from fear and ignorance. It terrified the authorities because it gave power to the powerless, dignity to the despised, and knowledge to the seekers who no longer needed priests as gatekeepers of God. Jesus embodied what he had discovered in his hidden years, that God is not distant, not confined to temples of stone, but present within every heart, waiting to be realized. Now let us consider something daring. What if Jesus never intended to found a religion at all? What if his true mission was to awaken humanity to the universal path, the eternal wisdom that flows through all traditions? The mystics of every culture have spoken of the same truth, that the divine dwells within, that love is the highest law, and that death itself is but a veil over eternal life. Jesus, in his missing years, may have seen that all paths converge upon the same summit. His mission, then, was not to divide, but to unite, not to bind humanity under one creed, but to free it through one eternal truth. Think of his words in John's Gospel, "You will do even greater things than these." This is not the voice of a man demanding worship, but of a master urging his students to realize their own divine potential. The Church, however, could not allow such radical empowerment to flourish. For if people believed they could access God directly, the entire system of control would crumble. So the missing years were buried, the forbidden gospels burned, and the narrative reshaped into something manageable: obedience, hierarchy, and submission. But truth is not so easily silenced. The rediscovery of ancient texts in the 20th century was no accident. Humanity is awakening, and with that awakening comes the need to reclaim what was lost. And here lies the most important revelation of all. The missing years of Jesus are not only about the past, they are about the present, about you. For what Jesus discovered in his journeys, what he carried back to Galilee, was the eternal truth that every soul can awaken to the divine. His missing years mirror your own spiritual journey, the years of seeking, questioning, wandering, and yearning for deeper meaning. Just as he walked among sages and returned transformed, so too are you invited to seek wisdom wherever it can be found, to integrate it, and to awaken the divine spark within yourself. This is the secret the Church feared most, that Jesus' message was not about blind belief, but about personal transformation, that the kingdom of God is not locked in a future heaven, but here, now, within you. That salvation is not a matter of rituals, but of awakening to the eternal presence of God already alive in your soul. Pause for a moment and let this sink in. The missing years of Jesus are not just history, they are prophecy. They reveal that the Christ is not bound to one man 2,000 years ago, but is a living reality that can be born within each of us. This is why the final revelation is the most powerful. The true mission of Jesus was not to make you a follower, but to make you a Christ, a bearer of divine light in a world of shadows. And now I ask you, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you remain within the walls of what has been handed down to you, or will you dare to step beyond, to seek the wisdom he himself sought, to walk your own missing years until you awaken to the truth within? Share your reflections, because your journey is part of this great unveiling. As we conclude this exploration, remember that history is never finished. Manuscripts may be burned, temples may crumble, and authorities may impose silence, but truth cannot die. It resurfaces in whispers, in forgotten scrolls, in visions, and in hearts that dare to seek. And perhaps, in this very moment, it has resurfaced in you. So when you think of the missing years of Jesus, do not only ask, where did he go? Ask instead, what do these years mean for me? For the answer is clear. They mean that the path he walked is the same path open before you, the path of awakening, the path of love, the path of union with the eternal. And that is the truth the Church never wanted you to know. Thanks for looking.